Imagine having to perform like a heavy kettlebell workout just to get a single wrinkle out of your shirt. And doing that while simultaneously cooking your breakfast over a completely unpredictable indoor campfire.
Oh, that sounds absolutely exhausting.
Right. But that wasn't some extreme sport. That was just a standard Tuesday morning on the 19th century American frontier.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are going on a deep dive into the lost language of the American pioneer. And this topic was heavily sparked by the new 2026 Netflix adaptation of Little House on the Prairie.
Which is such an interesting adaptation to analyze.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive is to bridge the gap between the way you and I speak today, an era filled with modern slang, or what our sources affectionately call modern brain rot.
Right, the brain rot. Yeah, we want to bridge that gap between our modern slang and the hyper-specific, incredibly rugged reality of pioneer speak. Because the jargon of the prairie, it isn't just old-fashioned vocabulary, it's at the very soul of the settler's story. It's the secret ingredient that makes Laura Ingalls Wilder's lore feel so tangible and real to us even now.
What's fascinating here is how the new Netflix series actually handles that language.
Yeah.
I mean, the showrunners face this really tricky balancing act when adapting history.
Yeah, how do you make it sound authentic without alienating the audience?
Exactly. They have to clean up the dialogue just enough for our modern ears, so the narrative flows. But wisely, they lean heavily into these colorful, historical colloquialisms. Language, in this context, it acts as a time machine. It shows us exactly how perilous and demanding frontier life truly was.
Every single word mattered.
Yeah, every noun, every verb they used carried a specific weight, direct connection to their survival.
Absolutely. And before we can really understand the psychology of how these pioneers lived their day-to-day lives, we have to look at the literal mechanics of the ground beneath their feet and the water they drank.
The physical foundations.
Right. The physical construction of their world completely dictated their vocabulary. Like if you were building a frontier cabin and you were fortunate enough to graduate from a packed dirt floor, you didn't suddenly get smooth hardwood. You got what they called a puncheon floor.
And a puncheon floor is the perfect starting point to dismantle the sort of Hollywood gloss of frontier life. Because in the 2026 series, the cabin features these uniform planks that look, well, quite a bit like the commercially milled hardwood floors you might have in your living room right now.
Yeah, they look pretty nice on TV.
But a true puncheon floor was born out of extreme logistical constraints. Without a water-powered sawmill nearby, hand-hewing logs into perfectly flat, uniform floorboards, that would take weeks of intensive labor. A family racing against the coming winter simply couldn't spare that time.
So the compromise was the puncheon. Our sources describe how you take a log, split it straight down the middle, lay the rounded bark side into the dirt, and then just leave the flat split side facing up to walk on.
And getting that flat side wasn't some delicate process. It was achieved by aggressively hacking at the wood with a broad axe or an adze.
Sounds like a nightmare for your feet.
Oh, definitely. The result was a surface that was profoundly uneven, covered in deep gouges, and just aggressively splintered. The gap between each log could literally swallow small tools or dropped food.
So you're trying to walk across your own bedroom in the dark, and the floor itself is an active hazard. It grounds you in the brutal reality of their environment. You couldn't even navigate your own home without dealing with the rough terrain of the frontier.
No safe haven, really.
Right. It was an environment that demanded heavy-duty solutions just to secure basic necessities. Which brings us to a massive piece of pioneer engineering from our sources, the windlass.
Yes, the windlass. It's featured really prominently in episode 5 of the new series, set in Kansas. We see Charles "Pa" Ingalls and the character played by Adam Scott building one together. It's this essential piece of primitive machinery.
To help you visualize this, a windlass is basically a horizontal wooden barrel suspended over a well hole and rigged to a hand crank. You wind a thick rope around that barrel drum. It acts as a force multiplier.
A very necessary force multiplier.
Exactly. Turning that crank allows a single person to haul incredibly heavy, dense buckets of wet clay, rock, and earth up from deep underground. Digging a well was exceptionally dangerous, back-breaking work. But it was a non-negotiable lifeline, right? Because if you don't tap into an aquifer, the family abandons the claim or perishes.
The stakes couldn't be higher.
But looking at the sources, I have a major question about their methodology here.
Oh, what stands out to you?
Well, the sources explicitly mentioned that once the well was finished and the water was flowing, the windlass was dismantled and taken down. If this complex contraption was such a vital lifeline for the family, why did they take it apart? I mean, it seems like a waste of a perfectly good crank. Why wouldn't you maintain that mechanical advantage to pull your daily water up?
That's a great observation. It comes down to the fundamental difference between heavy construction machinery and daily domestic utility. The windlass was engineered to maximize torque for hauling dead weight like hundreds of pounds of wet earth.
Okay.
Operating that hand crank still required a massive exertion of force and time because of the gearing ratio.
So it's like you don't use a bulldozer to plant a tulip.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. For day-to-day water retrieval, where you only need a few gallons for cooking or washing, a giant hand-cranked barrel drum is incredibly cumbersome. It's too slow.
So it actually slowed them down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Once the heavy lifting of the excavation was complete, the mechanical advantage of the windlass actually became a liability. It was vastly more efficient to revert to hoisting a standard bucket on a rope, just hand over hand. It saved time, and time was the most precious commodity they had.
Wow. So they solved the water problem. They seal the walls against the wind and lay down the splintery puncheon floor. But conquering the elements outside simply traps the family inside with a completely new set of grueling physical demands.
The indoor challenges.
Right. The focus shifts entirely to the domestic machinery of survival. We enter Ma's domain. And the vocabulary here, it sounds like a list of modern phobias or negative emotions, but these were the most vital tools in the cabin.
The prime example of this domestic machinery is the spider.
Yeah, the spider. In the show, Caroline Ma Ingalls will ask for the spider at mealtime. And for anyone watching, she is not asking for someone to squash a bug. A spider was a heavy cast iron skillet used to fry up frontier staples like salt pork.
But it wasn't a standard flat-bottom pan like we use today.
No, it was forged with 3 distinct short legs protruding from the bottom.
And those 3 legs are just a brilliant piece of functional thermodynamic design. Think about it. A modern flat-bottom frying pan requires a perfectly flat, highly regulated heat source, like an electric or gas stove.
Which they definitely did not have.
Right. A pioneer hearth is a chaotic bed of live, shifting, uneven coals. If you place a flat pan on uneven coals, it tips, and you lose a week's worth of precious calories straight into the ashes.
So the 3 legs create a stable tripod. It allows the heavy cast iron to sit perfectly balanced directly over the hottest part of the embers, regardless of how irregular the surface of the fire actually is.
Exactly. It creates a predictable cooking surface out of a highly unpredictable heat source.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you combine the relentless heat of the hearth with another monumental domestic chore, the laundry. The sources emphasize a tool called the sat iron.
The sit iron, yes.
And the sat here does not mean miserable, even though the chore probably was. It traces back to an Old English term meaning heavy or solid. These were pointed blocks of solid cast iron, and without power cords, the only way to heat them was to place them directly into those hearth coals.
The mechanics of utilizing a set iron really reveal the sheer time poverty of the pioneer woman. These irons often weighed between 5 and 9 pounds each.
That is basically a dumbbell.
It is. And because cast iron loses heat rapidly when pressed against damp, cold fabric, a single iron was virtually useless.
So you had to keep 2 in constant rotation. One is actively pressing the fabric while the second is sitting in the coals absorbing heat.
And you are swapping them relentlessly. The workflow is staggering.
Ah.
You are managing the exact temperature of a live fire so the iron gets hot enough to press out wrinkles, but not so hot that it instantly scorches the family's only clothing.
It totally reframes our entire concept of domestic chores. Using a spider skillet over live coals while simultaneously managing a continuous kettlebell workout with 2 scorching heavy sate irons.
I mean, that is an industrial assembly line run by a single person in a tiny, smoky room.
It highlights a life governed by unending clockwork efficiency. Because if you stop moving, the iron cools down, the fabric stays damp, the fire burns out, and the food is ruined.
Wow.
The designs of the spider and the sate iron weren't just quirky antiques. They were mandatory adaptations to an environment that offered 0 margin for error. The sheer caloric output required just to keep the household functioning is mind-boggling. And that relentless efficiency was demanded because the frontier was actively hostile.
Yeah.
Even if you secured the cabin, built the fire, and boiled the water, the environment still found a way to breach the walls.
It always did.
Which shifts our focus to the medical realities of the 19th century, where sickness was just this constant shadow companion.
The pioneer vow of in sickness and in health leaned incredibly heavily on the sickness aspect. The 2026 Netflix series confronts this head-on in episode 4, introducing a terrifying threat known as the ague.
Right, ague. It was the common 19th century terminology for malaria. It was characterized by severe intermittent fever spikes, violent chills, and horrifying hallucinations.
It was devastating.
But I have to pause here because this directly challenges our modern geographical assumptions. When you and I think of malaria today, we think of tropical climates, we think of rainforests and jungle mosquitoes. Wait, malaria on the American prairie? It is wild to think that this was just a standard, expected threat for pioneers huddled in a cabin in the Midwest.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it makes perfect ecological sense, actually. The unsettled American frontier of the 19th century looked vastly different than the manicured farmlands we see today.
How so?
Well, the Midwest was heavily defined by undrained wetlands, massive river bottoms, and stagnant swamps. Before modern agricultural drainage systems were installed, it was a perfect, sprawling breeding ground for the Anopheles mosquito, which transmits the parasite.
And their primary defense against this microscopic threat brings us to another vital word from our sources, quinine.
Quinine is a chemical compound. It's a bitter white powder derived specifically from the bark of the cinchona tree. In both the original Laura Ingalls Wilder novels and the new adaptation, it is the desperate standard treatment to break the malarial fever.
Yeah, in episode 4, we watched Dr. George Tan desperately hunting for this specific treatment to save the family, but finding pure quinine wasn't a matter of foraging in the nearby woods.
Not at all. And this raises an important question that kind of shatters a major American myth. We hold on to this romanticized image of the fiercely independent, self-reliant settler who lives entirely off the land and needs no one.
But you can't forage medicine out of prairie grass.
Exactly. The cinchona tree is native to the Andes Mountains in South America. To get quinine to a dirt floor cabin in Kansas required a rudimentary, highly volatile global supply chain.
That's incredible to think about.
It had to be harvested, processed, shipped across oceans, loaded onto trains, and finally carried by traveling doctors or merchants on horseback.
It exposes the profound fragility of their existence. I mean, all the rugged individualism, the calloused hands from the ads and the sate iron, none of it mattered if the supply chain failed.
One broken link and they were helpless.
Yeah, the only thing standing between a pioneer family and total devastation was a fragile trade route bringing a specific botanical powder from thousands of miles away. Their survival was intrinsically tied to a global network they could barely comprehend, let alone control.
It creates a terrifying baseline of anxiety. You are doing everything right, working yourself to the bone, and yet you are completely dependent on factors entirely outside of your control.
So we have to look at the psychological toll of this. You are living with the constant looming threat of the egg. You are trapped in the back-breaking, endless industrial loop of the sate iron. You are stubbing your toes on splintered puncheon floors in the dark.
That's a lot.
How do you prevent a total mental collapse? How did these families endure this level of physical and medical terror without just losing their minds?
Well, the psychological countermeasures are just as important as the physical ones. And that brings us to the final, lighter side of pioneer lingo, the language of release. The shared culture that bonded these families together against the dark.
Which perfectly sets up our next word from the sources, the jig. Long before any modern viral dance trends like the gritty or whatever, there was the jig. This wasn't a refined ballroom waltz. It was born out of classic Irish, European, and early American folk traditions.
It was incredibly energetic.
Very. It was a rowdy, explosive, and rare way to blow off steam, usually accompanied by Charles basically attacking his fiddle inside that tiny cabin.
The jig represents a necessary contrast. Think about the quiet, heavy, solitary exhaustion of managing the sate iron all day. The jig is the exact opposite. It is loud, communal, and fast.
A total release.
The physical isolation of the frontier breeds a desperate need for explosive, joyful release. Today, the word has been kind of stripped of that joy. We only really hear it in the idiom, the jig is up, meaning a lie has been exposed or a scheme is ruined.
It's devolved into a phrase about cynicism. But for the frontier family, a jig was an act of pure, unadulterated survival. It was a psychological release valve. And speaking of the psychology of survival, we have to look at the most famous term from the entire lore, half-pint.
Ah, yes. Charles's enduring nickname for his daughter, Laura.
In 19th century American slang, particularly around Independence, Kansas, half-pint was a popular colloquialism used to describe a very short person, essentially roughly the size of a small dairy container.
It's very literal.
It is. And it's a detail that refuses to die. It survived the original books, it anchored the iconic 1970s television adaptation, and it remains a massive emotional center of the 2026 series. So what does this all mean?
It's about connection.
When you break it down, calling your daughter half pint is the 19th century equivalent of lovingly roasting your kids. They are surrounded by deadly swamps and grueling labor, and Paul is taking time to call his daughter shorty.
It's the anchor of their shared humanity. If you only focus on the mechanics of the windlass and the supply chain of the quinine, you are looking at a life defined strictly by mechanical survival and terror.
It just becomes a textbook of misery.
Exactly. But words like half pint and jig inject the humanity back into the history. The inside jokes, the affectionate teasing, the frantic fiddling on a Saturday night that builds a family identity.
Yeah.
It was that specific shared identity that made the truly unbearable aspects of their rugged reality actually bearable. They didn't just survive the elements, they actively cultivated a life amidst them.
They forced joy into a landscape that actively tried to withhold it. And that brings the mission of this deep dive right back to you listening to us today. Whether you are firing up the new Netflix series this weekend to stay current with pop culture, or you are a lifelong fan of the books, decoding the mechanics behind these words transforms your experience.
It really does. It takes a historical drama and turns it into a deeply immersive, visceral reality.
You stop just watching the characters and start understanding the physics and the stakes of every movement. When you see Ma lift that cast iron, you know the heat she is managing. When you see Pa digging, you understand the engineering of the well.
And frankly, it should make you profoundly appreciative of the modern conveniences you are likely utilizing right this very second. You can appreciate the perfectly uniform, splinter-free floors beneath your feet.
Oh, absolutely.
You can be grateful for a lightweight electric iron that plugs neatly into a wall socket, requiring 0 live coals. And above all, you can be thankful for easily accessible medicine that doesn't rely on an erratic 19th century supply chain bringing bark powder all the way from South America.
The contrast is completely humbling. Tracking the evolution of these words reveals the exact distance our society has traveled.
It really does. It's a huge distance.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over regarding the wild evolution of this language. Consider how drastically the definitions of these exact words have shifted in our collective minds over time. A spider went from being a vital, life-sustaining piece of thermodynamic engineering for your family's breakfast to a household pest that you trap under a glass and throw outside. A jig went from being a joyful, rowdy dance that saved a family from psychological collapse to a cynical phrase about being caught in a lie. It makes you wonder, what everyday word in your kitchen right now will be completely misunderstood by someone watching a historical drama about the 2020s in 100 years? Think about it. Keep questioning the world around you. We'll see you on the next deep dive.